Welcome! I've been painting pewter minis for a few years now, particularly horses, and I have fallen so in love with this type of modeling material that I wanted to share with you my 9-step process and materials for prepping and priming pewter minis for a long-lasting paint job. Knowing what to look for is both the simplest and most important step. I'm looking for any molding and casting imperfections like obvious seam lines, flashing, spurs, dents, or rough texture that wasn't the artist's intentional texture effect. These horses were sculpted by Maggie Bennett, who I find sells really nice models, so my prep work on these minis is minimal. I make sure to note any artist signatures or logos so as not to fill those in later. Since pewter is a soft metal, sometimes limbs are bent, and I straighten them by adding slow and steady pressure. Now that I know what I'll need to fix, I can move on to the next simple step, cleaning. So far, all the pewter minis I've purchased were poured for molds, which means they often have mold release on them, and this could make it difficult for paint to stick to the models if it's not fully removed. I use two methods for removing mold release, and one of them is Humboldt dish soap, baking soda, and warm water scrubbed with a toothbrush. I make sure to use anti-grease dish soap, and the baking soda helps work like a wet sand. A second method I learned from Smooth On, a major mold making and resin casting supply company. They recommend using isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol to remove their mold release agents. The dents, pinholes, and some of the seams I fill with a filler putty like Tamiya Putty in white or Bondo Spot Putty. I like to use the Tamiya for models I'll prime in white and the Bondo for models I'll prime in red or other dark colors. I apply both with a toothpick and gloves. Aside from the nitrile gloves you see here, I'm also wearing a vapor-rated mask and I'm working in a space I ventilated as well as I can because both Tamiya and Bondo contain smelly solvents. There are other less smelly alternatives such as green stuff and Milliput. There are also water-based acrylic modeling paints. My preferred tools for removing seams and imperfections are automotive sandpaper, sanding pads, sanding twigs, and diamond-coated needle files. Other options are hobby knives or specialized seam removing tools, which do come in handy for larger imperfections or for removing spurs and flashing. If there's any rough texture, I buff with the fine grit sandpaper, usually 600 grit ultrafine and 1500 grit ultrafine. I also use my 3M ultrafine sanding pad. I find the sandpaper is best for smoothing and leveling the surface, but the 1500 grit especially can sometimes make the pewter almost mirror-like, and I found that mirror-like quality too slippery for primer. The sanding pad, however, adds very, very fine lines that have been the perfect tooth for primer on my minis. See how it's more of a matte surface now and not as glossy? By the way, all of my tools and supplies are linked below. Also, for this step, I've switched from the vapor mask to a more comfortable mask rated for particles, and I'm wearing eye protection just in case. I remove all the microscopic metal shards with an isopropyl soaked cotton ball. Then I take the models to the sink for another soap pen baking soda session just to be absolutely sure I got the last of the mold release from out of all of those tiny details, and it removes finger grease. After thoroughly drip drying, I make sure to handle the minis with gloves going forward to keep skin oils off of them. To make priming easier, I mount my horses to assorted objects using double-sided foam mounting tape. I found there are two important things about priming pewter minis. One is to use a primer formulated for metal for best results, particularly best adhesion. Second is to get a primer can that sprays finely so I can preserve all of those amazing details. Duplicolor Sandable Primer has become my personal go-to primer over the years as it meets both of that criteria, and being an automotive primer, I found it cheaper and easier to get than other options, for me at least. Aside from that, priming pewter is very similar to priming any other model. I make sure to follow the instructions on the can, particularly the spray distance, temperature, and humidity requirements, and then it's generally smooth sailing. For Duplicolor Sandable, that means shaking the can for at least 1 minute and spraying about 8 to 10 inches away when the temperature is between 69 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity less than 60 to 70%. Personally, I found there is flexibility to deviate from those instructions, and that's another reason why I love this brand, but that's a separate video haul in itself. For best results, stick to the instructions on the can. Spray pattern is important too. I always start spraying well before the spray reaches my model. I swing the can parallel to coat the model evenly, and I won't stop spraying until the can is well past the model. For respiratory safety, I make sure to wear that vapor mask again, and I either spray outside or in a garage that's separate from my living areas. I just spray one light coat of primer and then I let my model dry and examine again to see if I missed anything at the prepping stage. I usually find at least one thing I missed, like a hard to reach seam or a small pinhole. And so I repeat the sanding, filling, and cleaning steps as needed and spray a second light coat of primer. I rarely spray more than that as these tiny models can quickly lose detail. And true, as a last step, I do have to pop the models off the tape to reach their undersides fully. I know I'm done when I don't see any major flaws. I still have a lot of details and an even coat of primer. Now for my painting style, I found opacity of the primer is not as important as an even coat. So in other words, it doesn't need to be fully white or fully red. It just needs even tooth for my layers of acrylic paints. If I was using a transparent painting medium like pastels or dry pigment, I might want an opaque primer, although there's always the option to add a thin layer of acrylic paint first. It's really personal preference at that point. Once the primer is fully dried, my final tip is to store pewter minis in a Ziploc bag until I'm ready to paint. This lets me touch them without getting skin oils on them and keeps them free of dust. Thank you so much for giving me a little time out of your day to watch, and I hope this leaves you inspired to find a pewter mini and give prepping and painting a try. And with that, I'll let you get back to your day. Bye!